I remember that day so vividly. One of those clear memories you just can't shake. It started as any other day, and if you'd told me that morning what was about to happen, I would have laughed in disbelief. I was on my way to a meeting with a client. Nothing unusual, really, except as I was halfway there, I got a call saying the meeting was canceled. A last-minute cancellation, completely unexpected. That's what set everything in motion. I thought to myself, what a waste of a drive. But then another idea struck me. Maybe I could turn it into something good, a surprise for my wife, Rachel. We'd been married long enough to settle into a routine, but I knew a surprise dinner would be a welcome change. I could already picture her face lighting up, maybe even hear that laugh I'd come to know so well. I stopped by her favorite restaurant, picked up her favorite takeout, and headed home. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a couple of cars parked out front that I didn't recognize. At first, I figured she must have invited a few friends over, maybe a book club meeting or something. Rachel had always been social, and I knew she liked entertaining. I tried to brush off the odd feeling creeping up inside me. After all, I trusted her. But as I walked toward the door, things started to feel off. The living room light was dim, but I could make out something that didn't belong: clothes, shoes, jackets, and, oddly enough, a tie, strewn across the floor. My heart started to pound. It was unlike Rachel to be so careless, especially if she had company over. I paused, trying to convince myself that this was all innocent, that maybe I was just overreacting. But the pit in my stomach was telling me otherwise. I stepped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could, trying to make sense of the scene before me. It was dead quiet, except for faint sounds coming from upstairs. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was no reason to feel this way. But the sounds grew clearer. Laughter, muffled voices. And then it hit me, slowly and painfully, like an ache spreading through my chest. I knew, right then, that this wasn't just Rachel having friends over. I walked up the stairs, each step heavier than the last, until I reached our bedroom. I didn't even want to open the door. I knew what I was going to see, but I had to, for my own sanity, for closure, for whatever came next. I pushed the door open, and there she was, Rachel, caught in an embrace with her boss, Sam Dixon, and not just him. Two other men I didn't recognize. It was a scene I could never have imagined, a betrayal on a level I didn't even think was possible. I stood there, frozen, every memory of our life together flooding my mind, and all I could feel was an overwhelming emptiness. I knew then that my life was about to change in ways I'd never prepared for. Instead of exploding in anger or demanding an explanation, I did something else, something that would surprise even me. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and captured every single second of that scene. I wanted the proof, solid and undeniable. I wanted to be able to look back and know that I hadn't imagined any of it, that this betrayal was real. Rachel didn't notice me standing there, and I didn't wait for her to. I backed out of the room and went back downstairs, heart pounding, mind racing. For a moment, I sat there in the living room, surrounded by their discarded clothing, feeling numb. It felt surreal. I never would have guessed that my marriage, my life, would come to this. But sitting there, in that silence, I knew I had to act. After that moment in the living room, everything seemed cold and unfamiliar. The house I'd built with Rachel, the life we shared, all of it felt like it had been stolen. But in that surreal silence, I knew I couldn't let my emotions take over. I'd already taken a video, but that was just the start. I needed more proof, something I could use if things got ugly. I went straight to the kitchen. Rachel's cell phone was on the counter, unlocked. She was still upstairs, so I had time. I grabbed her phone, hands trembling, and started scrolling. I could feel my blood boiling with every message I read. The messages between her and Sam Dixon were bad enough, filled with things I never thought I'd see her write to anyone. But there were other names too, other men she called work contacts. They seemed anything but professional. The messages told a story I hadn't been aware of. I saw exchanges where she'd planned meetings at hotels, bars, even spots I'd taken her to on dates. In her photos, I saw selfies she'd taken in fancy hotel rooms, images she'd probably never meant for me to see. It wasn't just Sam she'd been seeing. There were at least two others, Their names burned into my mind as I took screenshots of every message, every photo, every last piece of evidence. If she thought I was clueless, she'd be in for a surprise soon enough. Just then, an idea struck me, something to let her know I wasn't the fool she thought I was. I saw her car keys hanging by the door. I grabbed them and stepped outside, looking at the 3 unfamiliar cars parked in front of our house. They were all sitting there, casually parked like they belonged. Without hesitating, I went to each one, crouching down to release the air from their tires. They'd have no quick escape when they finally realized I was here. I went back inside, locked the door, and picked up the landline to call the police. I kept my voice steady as I told them I suspected a break-in at my home, that there were people inside I didn't recognize. I knew what kind of commotion this would cause. By the time the police arrived, Rachel and her guests would be scrambling downstairs, only to find themselves stuck with flat tires and nowhere to go. I couldn't think of a better way to return the humiliation she'd just served me. I was just finishing my call when I heard voices from the stairs. I ducked back into the shadows of the living room, letting them come into view. They were laughing, talking like they hadn't a care in the world. Rachel and Sam Dixon led the way, with 2 other men trailing behind. They were acting like they owned the place. And maybe they thought they did, with me not supposed to be home for another day. As they headed for the door, Rachel paused. Her smile disappeared, replaced by confusion when she saw it was locked. She glanced around, then looked back at the men as if they might have the answer. One of the others stepped forward, yanked at the handle, and then muttered something under his breath. They started fidgeting, checking their phones, glancing around nervously. One of them headed for the back door, hoping to make a quick exit, only to find it locked too. I stayed hidden, watching the panic build as they realized they were trapped. And that's when the flashing lights showed up outside. The police didn't waste time. Within moments, they were at the front door, knocking loudly. Rachel's eyes went wide, and she turned to Sam, who looked just as lost as she did. She glanced around, like she was still trying to understand what was happening. And in that moment, she finally saw me. I walked out of the shadows, phone in hand, looking right at her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I didn't need to say anything. I held up the phone, letting her see the screen with her messages and photos. Her face went pale. I saw the realization dawn on her, that I knew everything, that every lie, every excuse had finally caught up with her. The police were still knocking at the door, and I motioned toward it. "Go on, Rachel," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Don't want to keep them waiting." She looked at me, eyes full of panic, then turned to Sam, who looked like he was ready to bolt if he could. The police kept knocking, and finally, Rachel forced herself to unlock the door, opening it with a trembling hand. 2 officers stepped in, their expressions all business as they took in the scene. Rachel stammered, trying to explain, but the officers had no interest in her excuses. I watched as they listened to her rambling, clearly unimpressed. They glanced at me, raising their brows, and I handed them my ID, keeping things as calm as possible. "Seems there was a misunderstanding," I said, casting a cold look at Rachel and her friends. "I thought I was dealing with a break-in. Didn't realize it was a gathering." I let the last word hang in the air, watching Rachel squirm. She looked from me to the officers, her face reddening, but it was clear that she had nothing to say that would fix this. One of the officers turned to me and nodded. "We'll make sure they leave, sir. You mind stepping outside while we get this sorted?" I gave him a nod and stepped out onto the porch, hearing Rachel and the others stumbling over excuses as the officers questioned them. Standing in the cool night air, I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was the end of something I thought would last forever. And yet, in that moment, I knew it was better to face the truth than live in her lies. I waited outside, watching the other men slowly file out, each of them giving me a look as they passed. They didn't say anything. They just kept their heads down, probably still trying to figure out how they'd ended up in this mess. Rachel came out last, looking at me with a mixture of anger and fear. She didn't say anything, but I could see the fury behind her eyes. Finally, they all got into their cars, only to realize they weren't going anywhere. The sight of them standing around, muttering as they discovered their flat tires, almost made me laugh. I could see Rachel glancing back at me, but I gave her nothing, just stood there watching as they called for rides, too embarrassed to even look me in the eye. Once they were gone, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The silence felt heavy, but it was a relief. I sat down, thinking of all the evidence I'd gathered, knowing this was just the beginning. I still had a lot of work to do. The morning after that hellish night, I felt like I was floating between two worlds. Part of me was still numb from the shock, but the other part, the part that was determined to hold Rachel accountable, had already come to life. I knew I couldn't face what was coming alone, so I called the one person I trusted most for a situation like this. Jack, my old friend and lawyer. He'd been with me through thick and thin over the years. And if anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. We met at a small cafe we'd frequented back when times were simpler. Jack took one look at me and knew something was wrong. After we ordered coffee, I handed him my phone with the photos, videos, and screenshots I'd taken. He didn't say a word as he scrolled through them, his eyes hardening with every swipe. When he finished, he set the phone down, took a deep breath, and looked me in the eyes. Alex, this is beyond what I expected. I'm sorry. Mom, I don't even know what to say. I just nodded, feeling a mix of anger and gratitude. I didn't either, Jack. I never thought I'd be sitting here like this. But here we are. Jack wasted no time getting down to business. He explained that we needed to build a legal case, not just for the divorce, but to maximize my leverage over Rachel. And it wasn't just about her. I wanted the people who joined her in this betrayal to feel some heat too. Her boss, Sam Dixon, had as much to lose as Rachel did. And if he thought he could walk away unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. Jack started taking notes as I told him every detail I discovered. We mapped out every point, every incident, and every opportunity to hold Rachel and her companions accountable. As we reviewed the evidence, Jack's face grew more determined, and I could see that he was already formulating a strategy. We're not just going to settle this in divorce court, he said, looking at me with a glint in his eye. We're going to take this all the way. You're sitting on some explosive stuff here, Alex, and it's going to make an impact. He started with the basics, going over how we could use the evidence to our advantage. First, we needed a solid financial settlement. Rachel had shared our lives, our assets, and unfortunately for her, her job was now tied up in this as well. Her boss, Sam, wasn't just a co-conspirator. He was a liability to her company. If we played our cards right, we could make sure Rachel and Sam felt the consequences at work, too. After a while, Jack leaned back and crossed his arms. Here's the plan. First, we go after Rachel's workplace. We bring Sam Dixon into it, and we don't hold back. But it's not just Sam. There's someone even higher up that we need to talk to, Michael Reed. He's the guy who runs the division and has been turning a blind eye to this mess for months. Michael Reed was the last name I wanted to hear. He was well known in their company, respected, someone people looked up to. If he was aware of what was going on and let it slide, then he was just as guilty as the rest. I wanted answers from him, and I wanted him to know that his reputation would be tarnished if he didn't handle this properly. Jack went on, outlining a plan that would hit each person involved where it hurt the most. We'd start by approaching Michael Reed directly, presenting him with the evidence of Sam's involvement with Rachel. Jack was certain that, once Reed saw the extent of Sam's indiscretions, and how much of it happened on company time, he'd be willing to negotiate a settlement to avoid any scandal that might blow back on the firm. Next, we talked about the tennis club. Rachel had been meeting her instructor there for private sessions that went far beyond the court. I wasn't interested in embarrassing the club for no reason, but the owner, Daniel Fields, had allowed this to happen under his roof, likely aware of what was going on. Jack suggested we confront him as well, threatening to make public the club's lack of oversight if he didn't cooperate. It won't be a small settlement, Jack said with a smirk. If we go public with this, the club's reputation will take a hit, and members aren't going to be happy. He'll settle if he knows what's good for him. By now, I was starting to see the bigger picture, and the more we talked, the more empowered I felt. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about making sure they all felt even a sliver of the pain they'd put me through. Jack laid out the next steps in meticulous detail. Once we have these settlements lined up, we'll initiate the divorce. And we're going to ensure you come out of this with as much financial security as possible. You won't be paying spousal support, not after what she's done. But we'll make sure Rachel understands exactly what she's losing. He glanced down at the evidence on my phone again, then looked up at me with a serious expression. Alex, I need you to be prepared. This is going to get messy. Rachel might try to turn things around on you, play the victim, even accuse you of something to sway the courts. Are you ready for that? I nodded, feeling a grim resolve settle over me. I'm ready, Jack. She crossed every line imaginable. I want her to see that actions have consequences. He reached across the table and gripped my shoulder. Good. You deserve better than this, and we're going to make sure you get it. I'll draft a letter for Michael Reed and Daniel Fields, outlining our demands. With the evidence we've got, they'll have no choice but to listen. By the time our meeting ended, I felt like a man with a purpose again. I wasn't just reacting to Rachel's betrayal. I was taking control of my life back. And while I knew there would be painful moments ahead, I was ready to face them. With Jack's help, I was going to make sure that this wouldn't be the end for me. As I drove home, my mind replayed everything Jack and I had discussed, every step of the plan unfolding in my mind. There was still anger, still hurt, but now there was something more, determination. I'd been blindsided by her betrayal, but I wouldn't be left powerless. This time, I was ready. That night, I slept with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. The hurt was still there, but it no longer weighed me down. I had a path forward, a way to make sure Rachel and everyone else involved would face the consequences of their actions. They wanted to play games behind my back, but now I was the one setting the rules. And I wouldn't stop until each of them paid the price for what they'd done. Tomorrow, the first moves would be made, and it would all begin with Michael Reed. The next morning, Jack called me, his voice calm and professional as always. He told me he'd secured a meeting with Michael Reed, Rachel's top boss, who ran her department. Reed had agreed to a private discussion, clearly nervous after Jack hinted at what we had to show him. Jack and I had strategized meticulously. This wasn't just about money. It was about holding every person who'd betrayed me accountable. And Michael Reed? He was no innocent bystander. We met in a downtown office building Jack had rented specifically for situations like these, ensuring privacy and minimizing any chance of running into someone we knew. Jack wanted to maintain control over the setting, and by renting a neutral space, we ensured Reed wouldn't feel too comfortable. When he arrived, he looked confident, but his handshake was weak. He tried to make small talk, but we didn't waste time. Mr. Reed, Jack began, his tone razor-sharp. We're here to discuss certain events involving your employee, Sam Dixon, and Alex's wife, Rachel. I think you're aware of the situation. Reed's expression shifted, his smile tightening as he glanced between us. He knew what was coming, and the confident facade was cracking. Jack wasted no time, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of the photos and screenshots of messages I'd taken from Rachel's phone. Reed's eyes darted over the documents, and I saw his face pale. These were taken during company hours, Mr. Reed, Jack continued. Your employee, Sam, has been using his position and your company's resources for an affair that's been going on for some time now. And you, Reed raised a hand, attempting to regain control. Now, let's not jump to conclusions here. I wasn't aware of Sam's actions with Mrs. Shepard, I assure you. Jack didn't even blink. You were aware of his absences, weren't you? And of the business trips he and Mrs. Shepard took together? Billed the company accounts. Reed shifted in his chair, swallowing hard. I'll admit there may have been a lapse in oversight, but there's no reason to involve the company in a personal dispute. This is between Alex and his wife. No, I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. This isn't just personal. Your employee made it business the moment he started conducting his affairs on your company's dime. Reed tried to regain his footing, his voice strained as he addressed Jack. I don't see how this is relevant, but perhaps we can discuss a settlement privately to resolve the matter. Jack leaned back, a faint smile playing on his face. Exactly what we had in mind. Reed's confidence had completely crumbled. After some back and forth, Jack negotiated a settlement that amounted to $2.7 million. Part of it as compensation for my emotional distress, and the rest as a hush fee to keep their company's name out of this mess. Reed was clearly desperate to end the meeting as he signed the paperwork, his hand shaking as he handed it back to Jack. By the time he left, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. As soon as Reed was gone, Jack's demeanor softened, and he nodded approvingly. One down. Next up, the tennis club. The tennis club, a country club-style establishment just outside the city, was where Rachel had supposedly been taking private lessons with her instructor, a guy named Derek. I couldn't stand the thought of what those sessions really entailed. But now, with the settlement from Reed in hand, I felt stronger, more resolved. Jack had already arranged a meeting with Daniel Fields, the club's owner, and we headed over right after lunch. Daniel Fields greeted us, all charm and smiles. He clearly didn't expect what was coming, not from the casual way he welcomed us. We sat down in his private office, and he offered us coffee, trying to make small talk about the club and its exemplary reputation. Jack played along, listening politely, but I could see the fire in his eyes. Once Fields finally stopped talking, Jack leaned in, cutting straight to the point. "Mr. Fields, we have reason to believe that your club has been the site of inappropriate activities between my client's wife and her instructor." Jack's emphasis on the last word was pointed. "We have records of their visits, and let's just say, they weren't focused on improving her backhand." Fields' smile wavered, and his face reddened. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, like he was trying to decide if this was a joke. You're implying something I'd never allow here," Fields said, his voice quivering slightly. "Our club has standards." Jack nodded. "All business. Then you won't mind us sharing these messages and videos with your club's board and members." Jack opened his briefcase and pulled out copies of the evidence, screenshots, dates, and times that all took place on club grounds. "Members of your club pay to maintain those standards. I don't think they'd appreciate knowing what's been happening here on their dollar." Fields glanced at the evidence and paled, realizing that any scandal would put his club's reputation at risk. He tried to argue, but Jack stayed firm, laying out the numbers with brutal precision. The settlement Jack proposed wasn't small. If Fields wanted this kept out of the news, he'd pay. After a tense silence, Fields finally nodded, agreeing to a multi-million-dollar settlement. I watched him sign the paperwork with a grim expression, knowing he had little choice. When he finished, Jack shook his hand, thanked him for his cooperation, and we left him there, still holding the evidence he now wished he'd never seen. With the settlement secured, Jack and I left the club and drove back to his office. We'd taken the first big steps, and I could feel the weight beginning to lift. But the most difficult part was still ahead, initiating the divorce. Jack gave me a pat on the back as we left the building. "You're doing well, Alex. Just remember, this is about taking back control." For the first time since discovering Rachel's betrayal, I felt a real sense of accomplishment. I hadn't let the hurt drag me down. I'd used it, harnessed it to push forward, and now I was on the path to something that resembled justice. Driving home that day, I thought about everything I'd learned, about how betrayal had shown me a side of Rachel I didn't recognize. I wondered if I'd ever really known her at all, but that thought no longer hurt as much as it had before. Instead, it fueled me. The divorce would be a clean slate, a chance to close the book on this chapter and start fresh. As I pulled into my driveway, the house felt less like a reminder of what I'd lost and more like a symbol of what I was about to reclaim. I knew there were still hard days ahead, but I was ready. With Jack on my side, I wouldn't just get through this. I would come out the other side stronger with my dignity and my future intact. And Rachel? She would soon learn what it meant to cross someone who wasn't willing to be anyone's fool. With the settlement secured from both Michael Reed and the tennis club, I knew it was time to take the next step, officially filing for divorce. It was strange, the mix of relief and dread I felt as Jack and I discussed it. This marriage, this life Rachel and I had built together, was something I'd believed in, something I thought was unbreakable. But that illusion had shattered the moment I saw her with those men in our home. Jack and I met the following morning to finalize the paperwork. He assured me that with the settlements from Reed and Fields in place, my financial security was solid. Rachel, on the other hand, would face a harsh reality. I was determined that she wouldn't walk away with a cent more than she deserved. We laid out the terms. I would keep the house, retain control over my savings and assets, and avoid paying her any spousal support. Rachel wouldn't have access to a dime more than necessary, and I'd made sure she'd understand the consequences of her betrayal in every way possible. I knew that she would soon feel the sting of the choices she'd made, and the realization of what she'd thrown away. Jack arranged for the divorce papers to be served to her at her office. It was a fitting place, I thought. Her workplace had become a haven for her deceit, the very setting for her betrayal. This way, she wouldn't be able to dodge the reality of what she'd done. Once she signed, it would all be over, and she'd no longer have any claim over my life, my finances, or my home. That night, for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt a sense of freedom. There was no more waiting, no more wondering what to do next. I had taken action, faced the betrayal, and reclaimed my life. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying had finally started to lift piece by piece. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a man who had endured the worst and had come out the other side, still standing. But I knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey. I didn't want to just survive the divorce. I wanted to reinvent myself, to rebuild my life into something stronger and better than it had been before. I looked at myself, really looked, and realized that for too long I'd allowed life to happen to me. I had spent years focusing on keeping Rachel happy, working hard to support her dreams while letting my own ambitions take a back seat. That was over now. I started with the basics. I changed my daily routine, setting a goal to transform myself both physically and mentally. Every morning, I'd wake up early and go for a run. I hadn't focused on fitness in years, but now I was determined to get back in shape, to push myself, to feel strong again. I felt the progress every day, the weight lifting, the exhaustion that was starting to feel less and less like defeat and more like triumph. Alongside the physical changes, I started paying attention to my appearance in ways I hadn't in years. I bought new clothes that suited me better, clothes I felt good in, rather than just what Rachel had liked. I updated my look, got a fresh haircut, and for the first time, I felt like I was finally dressing for myself rather than for anyone else. I even met with an old friend who ran a small business and offered to help him with some consulting work. Little by little, I was starting to find my own rhythm again, independent of the life I'd shared with Rachel. As the weeks passed, I felt like I was reconnecting with parts of myself that had been buried for far too long. Friends I hadn't seen in years began reaching out, curious about my sudden transformation. I hadn't shared the full story of what had happened with most of them. To them, I simply explained that I'd gone through some personal changes. The divorce itself was still underway, but Rachel's attempts to delay it had only cemented my determination to move on. She tried reaching out a few times, calling to ask about the terms, even suggesting we meet one last time to talk. But each time, I shut her down, calmly and firmly. There was nothing left to discuss. Her actions had spoken for themselves, and no amount of excuses or empty apologies would change that. When she finally received the divorce papers at her office, she called me, her voice wavering as she asked me to reconsider the terms. "Alex," she said, her tone desperate, "I was wrong, I know that now. But do we really have to go through with this? We had something real. Can we at least talk about it?" For a brief second, I considered it. There had been a time when I would have done anything to make things right. But that time was long gone, and the betrayal she'd committed was too deep to simply forgive. I told her as much, my voice steady. "There's nothing to discuss, Rachel. You made your choices. Now we live with them." And that was that. She hung up, probably realizing for the first time that I wasn't the same man who'd once taken her back without question, who'd bent over backwards to please her. I had changed. I was stronger, more resolute, and I knew that this was only the beginning of my journey to fully reclaiming myself. In the days that followed, I felt the changes deep within. My friends noticed it too. The anger I'd carried had transformed into a quiet determination. I started dating again, taking things slow, but feeling alive in ways I hadn't in years. I was no longer Alex, the husband, but simply Alex, a man who had rediscovered his worth and his freedom. Every step of the way, I felt my confidence grow. I went out more, took trips I'd always wanted to take, but had put off because of Rachel's schedule. I found myself enjoying life for what it was, not for the approval or attention of anyone else. And in every reflection, every photo, I saw a version of myself I could be proud of. The divorce was finalized a few months later. Jack called me to let me know the paperwork was complete, that I could finally say it was over. There were no tears, no drama, just a quiet satisfaction that I'd done what needed to be done. The house was mine, the assets were protected, and the life I was building was all my own. Standing in the doorway of my home that evening, I took a deep breath, letting the reality sink in. This was my life, no longer defined by anyone else's choices or betrayals. Rachel was just a chapter in a book that was now closed, a memory that would eventually fade. And in her place was the possibility of something new, something better. That night, as I raised a glass to toast my new beginning, I knew that I was stronger than I'd ever been. I'd faced betrayal, loss, and the collapse of a life I'd trusted. And I'd come out on the other side, standing tall. From here on out, I was in control, and nothing, not even the memory of Rachel, would ever take that from me again. It's funny how life has a way of circling back when you least expect it. Years had passed since I'd divorced Rachel, and I'd made peace with my past. I'd rebuilt my life from the ground up. New routines, new friends, a fresh sense of purpose. The old pain and anger had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of pride in how far I'd come. Rachel was a chapter I'd closed and left behind, or so I thought. Then, on a quiet Saturday evening, I walked into a restaurant I frequented for a quick dinner. It was a place known for its calm atmosphere and cozy lighting, not the type of place where you'd expect drama. But as I scanned the room for a table, my eyes stopped dead. There she was, Rachel, sitting at a corner table, dressed in a way that reminded me of the old days, when she'd try to impress me with her style. But she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man who looked like he had money to burn. The custom suit, the shiny watch, the slightly forced grin, everything about him screamed wealth. He had his arm draped casually over the back of her chair, leaning in close as they laughed over their wine. I could have walked out then and there. In fact, part of me wanted to, but something in me hesitated. I wasn't the same man who'd caught her in the middle of her lies all those years ago. I was someone new, someone stronger. So instead of turning away, I walked straight toward their table, as casually as if I'd planned to be there all along. Rachel noticed me first. Her smile faded, and her face turned pale, the shock clear in her wide eyes. Her new boyfriend, who I quickly learned was named Matt, looked at me with mild curiosity, oblivious to the tension Rachel was radiating. I gave him a friendly nod. "Rachel," I said smoothly. "Long time no see." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Matt, trying to be polite, extended his hand to introduce himself. I shook his hand, maintaining eye contact with Rachel the entire time. "So, you must be Rachel's new partner," I said, turning to Matt. He seemed flattered, glancing at Rachel, then back at me, giving a nod. "Yeah, we've been together a while now." "You two know each other?" he asked, glancing between us with a casual smile. Rachel's expression tightened, but she still didn't speak. "Let's just say Rachel and I go way back," I replied. I felt a surprising sense of control as I looked at her, knowing she was clearly uncomfortable. I decided to keep going, casually but deliberately testing the boundaries of her new life. I leaned slightly toward Matt, lowering my voice just a little, like we were sharing a secret. "You know, I always wondered, has she mentioned anything to you about her history with other men?" Matt blinked, looking mildly puzzled. "No, not really." "Why?" I gave a small shrug, glancing at Rachel, who looked ready to bolt. "Well, let's just say she has a bit of a complicated history." I pulled out my phone, not to show any photos or messages this time, but to reference an email I'd saved for moments exactly like this one. It was an old email Rachel had written to one of her friends, talking about her plans to leave me for someone better back when we were still married. Turning the screen toward Matt, I gave him a moment to skim it, his expression slowly changing as he read the words. When he looked back up at Rachel, his smile had vanished. "What is this, Rachel?" he asked, his tone barely masking the frustration building beneath the surface. Rachel, for the first time, found her voice, but it was shaky and uncertain. "Matt, this was years ago. It's nothing. Alex is just trying to stir things up, she stammered, desperately searching my face for any sign of the man she'd once known, the one who might have softened, who might have backed down. But that man was gone, and all she saw now was someone with nothing to lose. I don't think so, Rachel, I replied coolly. Matt deserves to know who you are. The whole picture. It's only fair, don't you think? Matt pushed his chair back slightly, crossing his arms as he looked at her, clearly processing everything he'd just read. You told me you'd never done anything like that before, he muttered. But here's proof that you were planning it even when you were married. Rachel's face crumpled as she struggled to regain control. Matt, please, she pleaded, reaching out to touch his arm. It's in the past. I don't even know why he's here. This isn't fair. But Matt wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes met mine, and I could see the dawning realization that Rachel had never really changed. He gave a curt nod, his jaw clenched. I'm going to get some air, he said, standing up abruptly. Rachel's face went pale as Matt walked away, his footsteps echoing through the restaurant. She turned to me, anger flashing in her eyes. But I could see the fear there too, the recognition that everything she tried to rebuild might just be slipping through her fingers again. What do you want, Alex? She hissed, keeping her voice low. Why can't you just let me be? I leaned back, giving her a calm, measured look. Rachel, I don't want anything from you. I just thought Matt deserved to know the truth. That's all. She glared at me, the defiance crumbling as her anger faded to something closer to regret, or maybe even despair. For a brief second, I felt a pang of pity, but I pushed it aside, remembering all too well the pain and humiliation she'd inflicted on me. As she sat there, her gaze drifting to the empty chair across from her, I saw the realization dawning on her, the truth she'd been running from. She was alone, and no amount of money or charm could undo the choices that had led her here. Her gaze flicked back to me, searching for some sign of the forgiveness she'd probably never given herself. But I gave her none. I had nothing left to give her, no bitterness, no anger, just a kind of quiet resolve. I'd moved on. I'd rebuilt my life, and I wasn't going to let her pull me back into the past. I stood up, giving her one last nod. Goodbye, Rachel. Take care. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. The evening air was cool, refreshing, as if washing away the last remnants of the past. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In that moment, I knew I was truly free. Free of the betrayal, the hurt, and the memories. I'd walk through the fire and come out stronger. And now, finally, I was ready to start the next chapter of my life, fully and completely, with no shadows left behind. Walking away from that restaurant felt like shedding the last weight I'd carried from my past. I hadn't known how I'd feel seeing Rachel again, but as I left her behind, alone with her choices, I felt nothing but clarity. I'd already faced the pain, the betrayal, the anger, and after years of rebuilding, there was simply nothing left for me to give her. In the days that followed, I thought about everything I'd been through. I remembered those first days, raw and disorienting, where every step felt like dragging myself through quicksand. I remembered the nights lying awake, wondering how things had come to this, how someone I'd loved so completely could have betrayed me so deeply. I remembered thinking that I'd never be able to trust again, that I'd never see myself the same way. But I had, and I did. The journey had changed me in ways I could never have expected. It taught me that the most important relationship I'd ever have was the one with myself. I had learned to live with dignity, to stand up for myself, to walk away from what wasn't good for me. And that was something Rachel could never take away. In the end, she had been a catalyst for my growth, an experience that forced me to look at myself, to question who I was, and to rebuild my life with more strength and resilience than I'd ever known I had. After all this time, I was grateful to be able to say I had no anger left toward her, only acceptance. Life had given me a hard lesson, but it had also given me a second chance to find myself, to pursue the life I'd always wanted, and to finally let go. For those who had been through something similar, who had felt the same kind of betrayal, I had only one piece of advice. Don't let the hurt define you. It's easy to lose yourself in the pain, to believe you'll never move forward. But the truth is, there's more strength in you than you might realize. You have the power to rebuild, to find happiness again, and to be better for it. Looking out at the horizon, I felt nothing but a calm, steady resolve. My past no longer haunted me. I was free, finally, to move forward without looking back. And whatever the future held, I knew I was ready.